The mare knew death before Orion Kellen did. She could smell it in the smoke-thick air of Normandy, taste it in the metallic rain that fell like tears from a bullet-torn sky. While other horses reared and bolted from the thunder of artillery, Copper stood steady beneath him, her copper-colored coat gleaming even in the hellish twilight of war. Orion pressed his face against her neck as mortar shells whistled overhead. "We're going home together, girl," he whispered into her mane, the words barely audible above the chaos. "Every last one of us who makes it through this mess." But war keeps its own promises, and 3 days later, Orion woke up in a field hospital, tent with his left leg gone below the knee and Copper whinnying frantically, in a makeshift stable outside. The doctor, a tired man named Rutherford with blood under his fingernails, delivered the news with practiced detachment. "You're lucky to be alive, soldier. The shrapnel missed your femoral artery by inches." Lucky. Orion stared at the tent ceiling, counting the holes where rain dripped through. He could hear Copper pawing the ground, calling for him with that low rumble she made when she was worried. She'd been his mount for 2 years, through the Bocage country and the long push toward Berlin. They'd saved each other's lives more times than either could count. The real blow came when Sergeant Macready visited him later that week. The grizzled NCO sat heavily on a crate beside Orion's cot, his own arm in a sling. "Son, I got orders about the horses. Command's shipping the healthy ones to the Pacific Theater. The wounded ones." He didn't finish the sentence. "Copper's not wounded," Orion said quickly. "She's fine. Not a scratch on her, I know, boy. But she won't let anyone else near her. Won't eat. Won't drink. Dr. Rutherford says she's pining herself to death." Macready's voice was gentle. "Sometimes the bond between a man and his horse runs too deep for military regulations." That night, Orion fashioned a crude crutch from a tent pole and hobbled to the stable. Copper's head shot up the moment she heard his uneven footsteps. She nickered soft and low, pressing her velvet muzzle against his chest as he leaned against the stall door. "I know, girl. I know it hurts." He stroked her neck with trembling fingers. "But I need you to make me a promise. If we get through this, if we make it home, I'm going to need your help with something important." Copper's dark eyes seemed to understand every word. She'd always been like that, reading his moods before he felt them himself. In the quiet of the stable, surrounded by the soft sounds of horses breathing and shifting in their stalls, Orion told her about the letters in his kit bag, 23 of them, from families back home, mothers asking about their sons, wives wanting to know about their husbands, sisters searching for word of their brothers. He'd promised to write them all back, but how could he explain that their loved ones were buried in unmarked graves, scattered across French farmland? How could he tell them that their boys had died screaming for home in shell craters and foxholes that would soon be plowed under and forgotten? "I'm going to find them all, Copper, every grave, every boy who won't make it home." His voice cracked. "And I'm going to need you to carry me there." The mare's ears pricked forward as if she understood the magnitude of what he was asking. A journey not just across an ocean, but across the geography of grief itself. 6 months later, Orion and Copper stood on the deck of a Liberty ship as the Statue of Liberty emerged from the morning haze, his new prosthetic leg a crude affair of wood and leather straps chafed against his stump. But Copper's presence beside him made everything bearable. The Army had classified her as essential therapy equipment, after 3 different psychiatrists agreed that separating them would be detrimental to his recovery. The truth was simpler. They needed each other to survive. Back in Millfield, Iowa, the Welcome Home Parade felt like a performance Orion couldn't quite remember his lines for. The townspeople lined Main Street, waving flags and cheering, but their faces blurred together in his vision. He rode Copper at a careful walk, his artificial leg hidden beneath his dress uniform, smiling and waving at people who called out his name. His sister Cordelia waited for him at the end of the parade route, tears streaming down her face. She'd kept the family farm running while he was gone. Though the effort had aged her beyond her 28 years, her husband Flint stood beside her with their twin boys, each clutching small American flags. "You came back to us," she whispered as he dismounted carefully, using Copper's stirrup for support. "Not all of me," he said, but his smile was genuine. Home felt both exactly the same and completely foreign, like putting on clothes that no longer fit quite right. That evening, alone in his old bedroom, Orion spread the 23 letters across his quilt. Each one was worn soft from being read and reread during the long months of recovery. Mrs. Evangeline Brewster from Ohio, asking about her son Dewey, who'd been in Orion's platoon. The Kowalski family from Chicago, wanting news of their boy Stanley. Young Violette Mansfield from Georgia, barely 18 and already a war widow, hoping against hope that someone had seen her husband alive after the fighting at St. Vith. The letters were arranged like a map of heartbreak, each one representing a promise he'd made to himself in that French hospital bed. Tomorrow, he would begin the journey to fulfill them all. Copper grazed peacefully in the pasture behind the house, her copper coat burnished gold in the setting sun. She looked up when he whistled, ears pricked forward with that familiar intelligence that had saved his life so many times. She knew they weren't staying. She could sense the restlessness in him, the weight of unfinished business that pulled at his soul like a tide. Cordelia found him there as darkness fell. "You're not planning to stay, are you?" "I can't, not yet." He showed her the letters. "I made promises, Corey, to boys who won't ever see home again, to families who need to know their sons didn't die forgotten in some foreign field." She was quiet for a long moment, watching Copper move through the darkness like a ghost made of starlight. "How will you find them all? The graves, I mean." Orion touched the small notebook in his shirt pocket, a detailed record he'd kept of every battle, every fallen comrade, every hasty burial in the chaos of war. "I know where they are, every one of them. The question is whether I have the strength to see it through." As if summoned by his doubt, Copper walked to the fence and nickered softly. Even in the darkness, her eyes held that unwavering certainty that had carried them both through the worst of the fighting. She would go wherever he needed to go, carry him as far as his promises demanded. "Then I guess you'd better pack supplies for a long journey," Cordelia said finally, "because knowing you, you won't rest until every last family has their answers." The first letter he would deliver belonged to the Brewster family in Ohio. Dewey had died holding a picture of his sweetheart, and Orion knew exactly which oak tree marked his resting place in a field outside Carenton. It would be a 3-day ride from Iowa, but Copper had carried him farther on less. The Brewster farm sat like a child's drawing against the Ohio sky. Red barn, white house, green fields stretching toward the horizon. Orion guided Copper up the dirt lane, his artificial leg aching from 3 days in the saddle. Smoke rose from the farmhouse chimney, and chickens scattered from their path like autumn leaves caught in a wind. Mrs. Evangeline Brewster emerged from the kitchen door before he'd fully dismounted. She was a small woman with silver-streaked hair and hands rough from years of farm work, but her eyes held the particular brightness of mothers who never stopped hoping. "You're Orion Kellum," she said, not asking but stating it as fact. "Dewey wrote about you in his letters, said you were the finest horseman he'd ever seen, and that your mare could navigate a battlefield like she was born to it." Copper stood perfectly still as Orion struggled with the dismount, his prosthetic catching slightly on the stirrup. Mrs. Brewster made no move to help, understanding instinctively that his dignity required him to manage alone. When he finally stood on solid ground, she stepped forward and embraced him like he was her own returning son. "Come inside. You'll stay for supper, and I won't hear any arguments about it." The Brewster kitchen was exactly what Orion had imagined. From Dewey's stories, copper pots hanging from hooks, the smell of fresh bread, photographs covering every surface. Mr. Augustus Brewster sat at the table with his own war wounds, a missing hand from the First Great War, now covered by a leather glove. "Dewey talked about you constantly," Augustus said as they shared a meal of pot roast and potatoes. "Said you saved his life twice in the hedgerow fighting, pulled him out of a burning tank near Villers-Bocage." Orion's throat tightened. He remembered that day, the sickening smell of burning fuel and flesh, Dewey's screams as flames licked at his uniform. But he also remembered the jokes Dewey told afterward, how the boy had made them all laugh even with bandages covering half his face. "Your son was brave," Orion said finally. "One of the bravest men I knew. When the time came, at the end, he wasn't alone." Mrs. Brewster's hands stilled on her coffee cup. "Tell me." So Orion told them about the morning assault on Carentan, how Dewey had volunteered to carry messages between the pinned-down companies, about the sniper's bullet that found him in an apple orchard, and how Orion had crawled through the mud and machine gun fire to reach him, about the photograph of Dewey's sweetheart, a girl named Magnolia from their hometown, that the boy clutched even as his life slipped away. "He said to tell you that he was thinking of home," Orion continued, his voice steady despite the tears on his cheeks, about helping with the harvest and the church socials, and taking Magnolia dancing at the Grange Hall. "He said the last thing he saw wasn't the war, but your kitchen on Sunday morning, with you making pancakes and humming that song you used to sing when he was little." Mrs. Brewster was crying now, but her face held a peace that hadn't been there when he arrived. "Where's he buried?" "Under an oak tree about 50 meters from the orchard where he fell. I carved his initials in the bark before we moved out. D.A.B. Dewey Augustus Brewster. The tree overlooks a stream, and there are wildflowers that bloom there in the spring." Orion pulled a small wrapped package from his saddlebag. "I brought you this." Inside the cloth wrapping was Dewey's dog tag and a pressed flower from the field where he'd died. Mrs. Brewster held them like they were made of spun gold, and for the first time since Orion had known about Dewey's death, the weight on his chest felt a little lighter. That night, he slept in Dewey's old room, surrounded by high school football trophies and photographs of a young man who would never grow old. Copper grazed in the pasture beside the barn, content in a way that spoke of work well begun. 22 letters remained, scattered across 22 different states. 22 more families who deserved to know that their boys had been loved, had been mourned, had mattered to someone in those final moments when the world went dark. As dawn broke over the Ohio farmland, Orion saddled Copper and prepared to continue their journey. Mrs. Brewster pressed a package of food into his hands and whispered a blessing over both horse and rider. "Thank you for bringing our boy home to us," she said. But as they rode away toward the next name on his list, Orion realized that Dewey hadn't been the only one who'd come home that day. The Kowalski address led to a tenement building in Chicago's South Side, where Stanley's parents lived 3 flights up from a delicatessen that smelled of pierogi and pickled cabbage. Copper's hooves rang hollow on the empty streets as they navigated between streetcars and delivery trucks, her ears swiveling constantly at the urban chaos so different from the battlefields, where she'd learned to trust only Orion's commands. Mrs. Katarzyna Kowalski answered the door in a flour-dusted apron, her gray hair pinned back severely, eyes red-rimmed from what looked like years of crying. When Orion introduced himself, her knees buckled, and her husband Ignacy had to catch her arm to keep her upright. "Stanley," she whispered in accented English, "our Stanley." They sat in a cramped living room where every surface held photographs of a stocky young man with intelligent eyes and his father's square jaw. Stanley in his high school graduation gown. Stanley working at the steel mill before the war. Stanley in his army uniform, grinning at the camera with the confidence of youth that believed it would live forever. He wrote about the horse, Ignacy said, his own accent thicker with emotion. Said she was like something from the old country, from the stories his Babsia told about magical horses that could carry men between worlds. Orion glanced out the window to where Copper waited patiently at the hitching post. He'd improvised from a street lamp, even from 3 stories up. He could see her looking toward the building, as if she could sense the grief that permeated these rooms like smoke. "Stanley died trying to save others," Orion began, but Katarzyna held up her hand. "Please, from beginning, we need to know everything." So Orion told them about the winter of 1944, when Stanley had been assigned to Orion's reconnaissance unit, about how the boy from Chicago had adapted to military life with the same determination he'd brought to the steel mills, how he'd learned to move through enemy territory like a ghost despite his size, about the December morning when their patrol had stumbled across a German ambush that left half the unit dead in the first volley. Stanley was point man that day, Orion continued, his hands wrapped around the cup of coffee Mrs. Kowalski had pressed on him. When the shooting started, he could have dropped flat and saved himself. Instead, He charged the machine gun nest that was cutting us down, drew their fire long enough for the rest of us to find cover. Ignacie's calloused hands trembled as he lit a cigarette. This is how he died. Fighting to save his brothers, Orion confirmed. I was wounded shrapnel in my shoulder, but I crawled to where he'd fallen. He was still alive, still conscious. The last thing he said was about you both, about the Sunday dinners, and how his mother made the best pierogi in all of Chicago, and how his father had taught him that a man's worth wasn't measured in what he gained, but in what he sacrificed for others. Katarzyna was sobbing now, but through her tears she managed to ask, "Where?" "In a forest outside Bastogne. There's a clearing where we buried him and 3 others under a stand of pine trees. I marked the spot with stones arranged in the shape of a cross, and I left his prayer book, the one you sent him, buried with him, from his pack." Orion withdrew Stanley's rosary and a small metal fragment. "This is from the shrapnel that killed him. I thought you might want to have something." They held a memorial service that evening in the small Catholic church where Stanley had been baptized. The entire Polish community seemed to turn out, men from the steel mill, women from the neighborhood, children who remembered Stanley teaching them baseball in the empty lot behind the tenement. Father Kaminsky spoke about sacrifice and homecoming, about how the dead live on in the hearts of those who remember them. But it was Mrs. Kowalski's words that stayed with Orion as he prepared to leave the next morning. She stood beside Copper, stroking the mare's neck with surprising gentleness for hands so rough. "In old country, we have saying," she told him. "The dead are not truly gone until the last person who loved them dies also. Because of you. Our Stanley is still alive in here." She pressed her hand to her heart. "You carry him home to us across ocean, across time. This is miracle." As they rode south toward their next destination, Orion found himself thinking about miracles, about how Copper seemed to know instinctively which route would avoid the worst traffic, which stable owners would welcome a veteran and his war horse, which small kindnesses could bridge the gap between strangers and family. Perhaps Mrs. Kowalski was right. Perhaps some journeys were too important to complete without divine assistance. 21 letters remained in his saddlebag, but for the first time since beginning this pilgrimage, Orion felt something besides grief driving him forward. He felt purpose. He felt hope. Behind them, Chicago's skyline faded into morning haze. But ahead lay Georgia and a young war widow named Violette Mansfield, who deserved to know that her husband's last word had been her name. Violette Mansfield's address led to a sharecropper's cabin outside Valdosta, Georgia, where Spanish moss hung from ancient oaks like widows' veils. The journey south had taken 2 weeks, through autumn landscapes that blazed with colors Orion hadn't seen since before the war. Copper had developed a fondness for the back roads, where they could travel at their own pace without the noise and chaos of highways. The woman who answered the door looked far too young to be a widow. Violette couldn't have been more than 19, with honey-colored hair pinned back carelessly and a toddler balanced on her hip. A little girl with her father's dark eyes and stubborn chin peeked out from behind her mother's worn skirt. "You're him," Violette said simply. "The one Beaumont wrote about. The soldier with the copper horse." Orion dismounted carefully, his prosthetic legs stiff from the long ride. The little girl, she couldn't be more than 2, pointed at Copper with delight. "Horsey, her name is Copper," Orion said gently. "Would you like to pet her?" But it was Violette who stepped forward first, her free hand extended toward the mare's muzzle. Copper stood perfectly still as the young widow stroked her neck, tears already streaming down her cheeks. "Beaumont always said he wanted to buy me a horse someday. Said every Southern lady ought to have a fine horse to ride." Her voice was soft, musical with the cadence of rural Georgia. He was full of dreams like that, big dreams for a poor boy from the tobacco fields. Inside the cabin, which was sparse but spotlessly clean, Violette served sweet tea and biscuits while her daughter played with wooden blocks on the floor. A photograph of Beaumont Mansfield in his uniform occupied the place of honor on the mantelpiece, surrounded by wildflowers that Violette must have gathered fresh that morning. "Tell me about my husband," she said without preamble. "Tell me how he died." Orion had told this story twice now, but it never got easier. Perhaps it wasn't meant to. Perhaps the weight of it was part of the debt he owed to the dead. "Beaumont was a medic," he began. "The bravest man I ever served with, and I've known some brave men. He volunteered for every dangerous mission, every patrol where someone might get hurt and need his help." Violette nodded. "That sounds like him. Always bringing home injured animals when we were courting birds with broken wings, stray cats, even a fox kit once that had lost its mama the day he died. Our company was pinned down by sniper fire near a village called Domfront. 3 men were wounded and trapped in no man's land between our lines and the German positions. The captain ordered everyone to stay put. It would have been suicide to try a rescue in daylight." Orion paused to sip his tea, remembering the weight of that August afternoon, the way the heat had shimmered off the pavement and made everything waver like a dream. "Beaumont waited until I was distracted, then grabbed his medical kit and crawled out there anyway. Made it to all 3 wounded men, patched them up, started dragging them back one by one. The sniper got him on his 3rd trip. He was pulling Corporal Martinez to safety when the bullet found him." "Did he?" Violette's voice was barely a whisper. "Did he suffer?" "No," Orion lied, remembering Beaumont's agonized breathing. The blood that had foamed at his lips as his lungs filled. It was quick, and he was conscious enough to talk. "He told me about you, about little Magnolia here, about the house he was going to build for you both when he came home. He made me promise to tell you that loving you was the best thing he ever did with his life." The toddler had wandered over to Orion during the story, fascinated by his artificial leg. She patted it curiously with tiny hands while her mother wept silently into her apron. "He's buried in the churchyard of that French village," Orion continued. "The priest there, Father Dubois, spoke at the service, even though Beaumont wasn't Catholic, said any man who died saving others was welcome in consecrated ground. I carved both your names on a wooden cross, Beaumont and Violette Mansfield, together always." That night, Violette insisted he stay for supper, and they ate by lamplight while little Magnolia chattered happily in her high chair. The conversation turned to practical things: how Violette was managing alone, what she planned to do now that she knew the details of Beaumont's death. "I'm going to stay here," she said with quiet determination. "Raise our daughter where her father grew up, where his people are buried. But now I know he's at peace. I can start living again instead of just surviving." The next morning dawned clear and cool, with the first hint of winter in the air. Orion was adjusting Copper's saddle when Violette approached with a small package, wrapped in brown paper. "This is for you," she said. "Something to remember us by." Inside was a hand-carved wooden horse, no bigger than his palm, crafted with the skill of someone who understood the grace and power of the animal it represented. The workmanship was exquisite, every detail perfect from the flowing mane to the delicate hooves. "Beaumont made it," Violette explained. "He was always whittling, always making little toys for the baby. This was the last thing he finished before he shipped out. Said it was practice for the rocking horse he was going to build for Magnolia when he came home." Orion turned the carving over in his hands, feeling the smooth wood that had been shaped by a dead man's fingers. It was a gift beyond price, a tangible connection between the living and the dead, between the promises we make and the love that survives their breaking. As he rode away from the Mansfield cabin, the wooden horse secure in his shirt pocket, Orion realized he was carrying more than just news of the dead. He was carrying their love forward, delivering not just information, but the continuation of bonds that death couldn't sever. 19 letters remained, but each delivery was becoming less about ending something and more about beginning something else. Behind him, Violette Mansfield stood in her doorway, holding her daughter and watching them disappear into the morning. For the first time since her husband's death, she was smiling. 2 years had passed since Orion first saddled Copper for their pilgrimage of grief, and now only 3 letters remained in his saddlebag. The last one belonged to the family of Lieutenant Jasper Whitmore, a young officer from Maine who had died in Orion's arms during the final push into Germany. The Whitmore estate sat on a bluff overlooking Penobscot Bay, its white colonial facade gleaming in the late afternoon sun. Copper's hooves clattered on the cobblestone drive. As they approached the main house, the mare was graying now around her muzzle, and Orion's artificial leg had been replaced twice as his stump changed shape with age and use. They were both different creatures than they'd been when they started this journey, weathered by miles and marked by the weight of 20 stories they'd carried across the continent. Mrs. Cordelia Whitmore, no relation to his sister despite sharing. The name met them at the front door. She was an elegant woman in her 50s, dressed in the kind of understated wealth that spoke of old New England families and older money. But her eyes held the same hollow grief that Orion had learned to recognize in every mother's face. "Mr. Kellum," she said, offering her hand with formal courtesy, "we've been expecting you. Jasper wrote about you often in his letters about the sergeant who treated his men like sons and his horse like a partner in battle." The Whitmore parlor was a museum of family history, oil paintings of stern-faced ancestors, display cases filled with military honors from 3 generations of service, Persian rugs that had probably cost more than most families earned in a year. But dominating one wall was a collection of photographs showing Jasper's progression from laughing child to serious young officer, including several taken during his training, where he posed with other cadets who would never live to see their 25th birthdays. "Tell me about my son's death," Mrs. Whitmore said without preamble once they were seated with tea and small cakes. Her directness reminded Orion of his own mother, who had never been one to dance around difficult truths. "Jasper died leading his men," Orion began, and then told her about the bridge at Remagen, where her son had volunteered to take point in clearing German defenders from the far side of the Rhine, about how the young lieutenant had made it halfway across before the sniper's bullet found him, and how he'd used his last breath to shout warnings that saved 3 other soldiers from walking into the same trap. "He lived for 18 minutes after he was shot," Orion continued, his voice steady with practice. "Long enough to ask me to write to you, to tell you that he was proud to serve, proud to be a Whitmore. He said the family motto, honor above all, wasn't just words on a coat of arms, but the way a man should live and die." Double quotes. Mrs. Whitmore's composure finally cracked, and she wept with the quiet dignity of someone accustomed to bearing sorrow in public. When she'd composed herself, she asked about the burial, and Orion described the military cemetery outside Remagen, where Jasper lay among his fellow officers, each grave marked with a white cross and the promise that their sacrifice would not be forgotten. That evening, at Mrs. Whitmore's insistence, Orion dined with the family in their formal dining room. Jasper's father, Judge Harrison Whitmore, presided over the meal with the same gravity he must have brought to his courtroom, asking detailed questions about the war, about strategy and tactics and the larger meaning of their son's death. But it was Jasper's younger sister Penelope who asked the question that mattered most. "Was he happy?" she asked suddenly, her fork suspended halfway to her mouth. "I know that sounds foolish, asking if someone was happy in a war, but Jasper always found joy in everything he did, sailing, hunting, even his studies at West Point. I need to know if some part of him was still happy, even at the end." Orion thought about the young officer who had shared chocolate bars with French children, who had organized baseball games during lulls in the fighting, who had written poetry in his field journal and read it aloud to his men during long nights in foxholes. "Yes," he said firmly, "even in the worst of it, your brother found ways to make his men laugh, to remind them what they were fighting for." The day before he died, he was teaching a bunch of farm boys from Kansas how to waltz. Said every American soldier should know how to dance properly when he got home to his sweetheart. The conversation continued late into the evening, filled with stories and memories that painted a picture of Jasper Whitmore as both the perfect son these parents remembered and the natural leader his men had followed into battle. When Orion finally retired to the guest room they'd prepared for him, he felt the familiar lightness that came with completing another delivery, another promise kept to the dead. The next morning, Judge Whitmore walked him to where Copper waited, in the stable yard, groomed and fed by the family's grooms, but clearly eager to continue their journey. "You've given us a great gift," the judge said, pressing an envelope into Orion's hand. "This is not payment. What you've done is beyond price, but perhaps it will help you complete your mission." Inside the envelope was a bank draft for more money than Orion had seen in his lifetime, along with a letter of credit that would be honored at any bank in the country. Attached was a note in Mrs. Whitmore's careful handwriting, "For the man who brought our son home, and the horse who carried him there." As they rode away from the Whitmore estate, Orion realized that his journey was nearly complete. Only two families remained on his list, and then he and Copper could finally go home to Iowa, to Cordelia's farm and the peaceful pastures where a war horse could graze in contentment, and a wounded soldier could lay down the burden of other people's grief. But first, there were two more graves to visit, two more families who deserved to know that their sons had mattered, had been loved, had died with honor in a foreign land that would remember them long after the living had forgotten their names. The final letter belonged to the family of Private Kestrel Morrison, a quiet boy from Wyoming who had died in Orion's arms 3 days before the armistice was signed. As Copper carried him up the winding mountain road to the Morrison Ranch, Orion reflected on how fitting it was that their journey should end in this landscape of endless sky and wind-carved stone, so similar to the battlefields where it had all begun. But when they reached the ranch house, they found it empty. Windows boarded up and weeds growing in the yard. A neighbor, checking his cattle in the adjacent pasture, rode over to explain that the Morrisons had lost the ranch to debt 2 years earlier. After learning of their son's death, broke old Ezra's heart, the rancher said, adjusting his hat against the mountain wind. Lost his boy and his land in the same year. Last I heard, they'd moved down to Cheyenne, living with Mrs. Morrison's sister. The address in Cheyenne led to a modest house in a residential neighborhood, where children played hopscotch on the sidewalks and women hung laundry in neat backyards. Mrs. Violet Morrison answered the door in a house address and apron, her hair gone completely white since the photograph Kestrel had carried of his parents. "You're the soldier," she said, and something in her voice made Orion look more closely at her face. There was a serenity there that he hadn't seen in the other mothers, a kind of peaceful acceptance that spoke of grief fully processed and set aside. "Mrs. Morrison, I have news about your son, Kestrel," she said, smiling for the first time. "Yes, I know. He told me you'd be coming." Orion felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. "Ma'am, come inside, dear. Bring your horse around back. There's a small corral where she can rest." The Morrison parlor was filled with the smell of fresh bread and the sound of a radio playing softly in the background. Mr. Ezra Morrison sat in a wheelchair by the window, his legs covered by a wear-upon blanket. But his eyes were bright and alert when he saw Orion enter. "The messenger," he said with satisfaction, just like Kestrel said there would be. Mrs. Morrison poured coffee and set out slices of apple pie, while Orion tried to make sense of their strange welcome. Finally, she sat across from him and folded her hands in her lap. 3 months after we got the telegram about Kestrel's death, I started having dreams," she said matter-of-factly, clear as day, more real than waking. "Kestrel would come to me, looking just like he did when he was alive, and he'd tell me things about the war, about his friends, about a sergeant with a copper-colored horse who was carrying messages to all the families." Orion's coffee cup rattled against the saucer. As he set it down with trembling hands, "He told me you'd been wounded, that you'd lost your leg trying to save him and the others. He told me about the promises you'd made, about the long journey you and your horse were taking to visit every family. He said you'd be the last one to come, and when you did, it would mean you could finally rest." Mr. Morrison leaned forward in his wheelchair. "Son, we know how our boy died. We know he wasn't alone, wasn't afraid, wasn't forgotten. Kestrel told us himself, in ways that don't require letters or telegrams or official notifications." For the first time in 3 years, Orion felt the weight of his mission lifting from his shoulders, not because his task was nearly finished, but because he finally understood what he'd been carrying all along. Not just news of the dead, but proof that love transcends death, that some bonds are too strong for war to break, that the living